Hello, and welcome back to Impact Factor. Today I'm going to be talking about giving a presentation. Um, in this case, mostly oral presentations, but some tips for preparation and practice ahead of time. Some maybe tips and tricks for your slide design and the overall slide style that you want to portray. And finally, just a little bit on how to tell your research story, and how to make the biggest impact you can. So let's get into it. All right, so you have submitted an abstract to a conference and you've been accepted as an oral presenter. What do you do now? Well, there's a few things. Obviously, you could reach out to folks in your lab or your advisor and sort of obtain an example presentation that you can model yours off of. That's great. And honestly, sometimes research groups like to have the same sort of template style for their presentations. And so you're going to want to start with something like that. But overall, I think it's important to make sure you have your own style and your own voice, and that you give presentations like you want to give presentations. There are plenty of grad students who are uncomfortable speaking in front of audiences, and you can tailor your presentation to alleviate some of that stress. There are plenty of, presenters who really enjoy hearing themselves talk, and so that can be tailored into the presentation as well. The best way I can say to get better at doing presentations is to keep doing them. And so hopefully your first experience isn't at a major research conference. Hopefully you've had time to experiment and try presentations either at your own university or at more local events. But if it is, go for it. I mean, this is your chance, and look at it as an opportunity to learn, and get better, and keep doing it. Don't let it scare you away. So first, let's talk a little bit about preparation and practice. So, like I said, when you're building your presentation, you want to do it with plenty of time ahead of your conference travel, so that you can do a few things. One, I recommend that you give yourself enough opportunity to have the slides looked at by your advisor, and anyone else that you sort of trust on the content side of things. So what's the focus of your talk? Do the slides convey it? Is there anything that stands out to those people who are experts? They should let you know, just by looking at the slides. Another thing I recommend doing is giving yourself time to practice your presentation, both because you need to understand how long it's going to take, and often you have a specific amount of time given for your time slot, and so you want to make sure you're not rushing at the end, or you want to make sure you get to the most important part of your talk. The general rule of thumb that I was taught is that a slide of content is roughly equal to 1 minute for a presentation. Obviously, that can vary, but it's a good kind of standard baseline to start with. If you have a lot of quick slides, or you use animations and therefore you can put more onto one slide, obviously that won't count the same. But in general, it's a good rule of thumb. And so this practice that you're doing, it's definitely a good idea to practice by yourself, to yourself, in a mirror, or not into a mirror. But the other thing I recommend doing is getting some of your friends who are maybe in the same department or in the generally the same topic as you or field as you, but aren't necessarily experts in the research that you're doing to listen to your talk. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, they will be unable to get hung up on specific things associated with your research. And so they will focus more on other things like the pace at which you're talking, how confused they are by the end, at what point you lose them, and if your figures are beneficial at all to someone with, maybe a general understanding but not a specific specific focus like yours. So ask them to listen for those types of things, and then ask them for feedback. What we would do in my program is we would, get together, and we'd bring like cookies or something if you were the one presenting, and everyone would bring like a piece of paper or a computer and take notes. And here's where one of my biggest suggestions comes in is make sure you have numbers on your slides. And this is important for the final presentation as well, because it makes it so much easier for audience members to refer back to specific slide numbers when they have questions. But during these practice stages, it also makes a huge difference because you can have your friends or the people you're practicing with, they can write down specific notes about specific slides. So they can say, slide 1, you went way too fast. The other thing we would do is we would time each other, and we would sort of mark at what time point we got through a specific slide. So if you had gotten through your intro slides and you're already halfway through your time, then you know exactly where you need to focus on as far as cutting away some of the extra time. So keep numbers on your slides, practice with people, and try to include people in this practice who are not going to focus on your research and results, but more on the presentation and sort of the story you're telling as well. And on the day itself that you're giving your presentation, oftentimes you will need to check in with the moderator or the person hosting that session at the conference. So make sure you get there a little bit early, not early for your time, early for like the session, and tell them who you are. And, obviously for the big wigs in the room and the professors who everybody knows, becomes pretty obvious where they are. And so, for a grad student who's maybe not very well known in the field, go up to the person who's introducing the speakers and introduce yourself, and they'll give you any instructions that you need to know. And then the other thing is that at specific conferences, they have different, technology setups. Sometimes they want you to plug in your own computer. And in that case, make sure you have different options of adapters. You don't want to get stuck not being able to plug in your own computer. Sometimes they prefer to use a single computer and have you bring the presentation on flash drive and set it up, ahead of time during the break. And sometimes I maybe have been to one conference like this where they had me send the slides ahead of time, and so they had them all already saved onto the computer. That's less popular, I think, because it's, they want you to be able to work on it close to the presentation time. But so keep that in mind. Okay, so that's preparation and practice. So now you're ready to go. You've prepared and everything. Let's talk about some specific details about your slides. There are certainly tons of personal choices made when it comes to slide design, and so I'm certainly not going to talk about that at all. But here are some tips from a viewing perspective that makes slides easier to digest. First of all, don't put too much on one slide. Remember that the point at which you're talking and the information you're trying to convey is coming mostly from what you're speaking about. And so if you have so much packed into one slide, your viewers are now distracted by what they're looking at and they're not listening to you. And so, yes, it's easy to throw up, 4 or 5 different charts and plots and sort of squish them into one slide. But I'll tell you one thing that I have spent many times just zoning out from whoever's talking as I try and study these different charts and figure out what I'm looking at. So, I mean, this rule of thumb, I guess, is something that leads me to always suggest to use animations, and not animations in like a fancy sense. Just, if you're going to show 2 plots, for example, on one chart or on one slide, or you're going to have, 2 different messages on one slide because of the way your figure changes, my recommendation is that you separate them and only show what you want to talk about first. And then when you move on to the second part, you add the second part. And again, the reason is if you want me to listen while you talk about plot number 1, well, if you show me plot number 2 and I have decided that I already understand plot number 1, I am now looking at plot number 2 and trying to understand that myself. So, and animations aren't the only way to do it. You can have just very simple slides. You can have one slide with one plot, move on to the next slide. But the general concept here is that the content that you're giving to your viewers to look at should be matching exactly what you're currently talking about. And along the same lines, one thing to be cautious of is not displaying a slide for only a few seconds. While you feel like there might not be information on the slide, you have to remember that the people who are in the audience are seeing this for the first time. And so you might be able to say, look at this, here's the conclusion, moving on. They're still digesting, what kind of chart it is or what kind of plot it is and what the title of the slide is by the time you've already moved on. So this also kind of goes back to when you're putting plots on your slides. And obviously I come from an engineering background, so we had plenty of plots on our slides. But even the most standard of plots for people in your field. So for example, when I was in the battery field, we always showed graphs of, voltage versus current, right? And it was a cyclical tomogram, for example. And if you were in the field, you knew exactly what that looked like. And so, as soon as that flashed on the screen, you were like, oh, that's really great. And you would check the y-axis and blah, 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 right? But I am under the opinion that there's no such thing as wasted time in just pointing out what we're looking at. So you throw up a plot, right? It's on the screen. You want to do a few things before you start talking about the meaning of the plot and the results and everything. You want to lay out for the viewers what the plot is. What are they looking at? You want to say, okay, so this is a plot of voltage versus current. And as you can see here, we have voltage on the x-axis, we have current on the y-axis, and the different colors inside the plot represent different scan speeds, or different electrolytes used, right? So now in one sentence, everybody sitting there goes, okay, I understand the science behind this plot. I may not understand the application yet, or the results, or what they mean, but I know what I'm generally looking at. And the benefit of this is that anyone who was slightly behind in understanding the plot is now caught up, so that when you start talking about the results and the meaning, they're with you. Otherwise, you're starting to talk about how, well, this voltage window is much larger than normal, and so as you can see, these electrolytes are better than others. Meanwhile, those folks are still trying to figure out what the different colors mean or what the different axes are. So walk them through it. Hold their hand as you walk through the slide. It doesn't sound oversimplified. It doesn't sound condescending. It's you giving your presentation and making sure that the audience is with you the whole time. The other thing is, there's a lot of sort of traditions around giving scientific presentations specifically, including like if you have funding logos or university logos, having them sit on every slide, either, across the top, across the bottom. And, that can be great. I understand it, but it also tends to crowd the slide and be distracting. And while someone is, and while you want them to be focusing on the data that's coming out of the plot, that's being shown on the plot, they're focused on the university logo that looks like kind of like a bear with a smirk that's in the corner of your slide, right? And so while those things are important and maybe you want to include them in your title slide or your acknowledgement slide, you may find that they are distracting from the point of each slide. Similarly, a lot of folks end up with the last slide of their presentation being kind of a bland thank you, or I'll take any questions, or even acknowledgements. But and I don't recommend skipping acknowledgements. I think an acknowledgement slide is important, especially if you have funding or collaborators or people that you need to recognize. But during the question part of the presentation, you're going to end up leaving up a slide while you answer questions, unless, of course, you're going back to look at specific slides. And you want that slide to have meaning and impact. And so for people who are, still reading or maybe were distracted, you want that slide to have maybe like the most important outcomes of the talk. Or maybe you want to have a, this is what we learned, or this is what we're going to do next, or here are the papers that cover this, and specific journals that you can look at. So make the slide that hangs out there for a while you answer questions or while people clap. Make it mean something and make it impactful, and you'll be glad that you do, because the people who are slightly behind will end up being able to catch up. The only other thing I'm going to say about slides is that there's something to be said about the look and feel. And now, obviously, as a scientist and someone in a technical field, I will be the first one to tell you that design and beauty come second to results and meaning and message. But when you think about humans and how they're attracted to things that look good, a cluttered slide with colors that are difficult to see, or font that's too small, all of that sort of detracts from what you're trying to do, which is convey a message and share these exciting results. So my suggestion or my advice is to definitely give yourself time in your process to add a little bit of aesthetically pleasing touches to your presentation. And some of these things can be, suggestions from your friends who you ask to practice in front of. Or, you can say, is this font too big for you who's sitting in the back of the room? Or it's too small for you who's sitting in the back of the room? And get their thoughts, because, first impressions for people who haven't been looking at the slides for weeks like you have is super important, because they can say, wow, when you put up this slide, I was immediately distracted by this and unable to read that text box. And if there's someone who has like a good eye or some design, skills, creativity, ask them their thoughts as well. They don't have to be in your field. They don't even have to be, a scientist. They may have some suggestions as far as like accessibility for people, because you want to get your message across. And so, regardless of what that message is, what you want to do is cater to the people who are listening. And if they are going to listen better, if it looks nicer, then you should make it look nice. Okay, so that covers the slides. And I just have a few things to say about conveying your research message. I mentioned some of this when it comes to the slides, but a lot of times we give presentations and our nerves cause us to talk too fast, right? Or we, try to fit all this in and we can't, and we don't pause at all. We don't take a beat. Well, when you think about it, that's not really how people talk normally. If you're having a conversation with someone, especially if you're, trying to teach them something or convey something, you're going to pause and you're going to stop and you're going to, evaluate their feedback or their reaction or little nuances in how they behave. And you can do that when you're giving a presentation as well. Ideally, you would have some people you trust in the audience that you could sort of, gauge their reaction off of. But, in general, speaking at a normal pace and making sure that you pause, making sure that you take breaths, putting a glass of water there to make sure that you take breaths and drink water is not a bad idea either. It's sometimes like a hack. And speaking too fast can also be very monotone and kind of hard to listen to. And so giving your story, your research presentation, some personality and some ups and downs and some, excitement around what you're explaining can go a long way in encouraging your listeners to follow and to be excited with you about your research and to maybe look into it after your talk. Another thing is, I don't know, but there was a phase when I was in grad school where, everybody wanted to use a laser pointer. And, laser pointers are great. I completely understand the point. No pun intended. But the point of a laser pointer is to direct the eyes of the listeners to the specific part of the visual that you are referencing. And honestly, I've seen more often than not folks with a laser pointer overuse it and point at everything and hold it on something for way too long. And then the other thing is when you're nervous and your hands are shaking, the laser pointer is too, and that can be distracting for viewers and certainly doesn't add anything to your presentation. So if you must use a laser pointer, be cautious to only use it, once or twice, and to use it and then not use it. Use it and then be done with it instead of leaving it on while you shake. But my other suggestion is you can use other ways to direct people's attention to specific parts of your presentation. One of those ways is by having different plots show up at different times, especially specifically when you're talking about that specific plot. If you want to talk about a specific point on a plot, you can have an animation where an arrow pops up and disappears. So if you have the time to prepare your presentation, to have all of these animated dynamic movements around the story you're telling, I personally don't think you need the laser pointer. But that's just me. So that's one suggestion as well. And then telling your story. So as I mentioned before, a lot of times at a conference presentation, you are speaking to a lot of people in your field. And so the lingo and everything, you can be comfortable that most people in the room will understand what you're talking about. But I think the most challenging thing is to set yourself apart from most of the other kind of standard routine presentations. And folks at conferences have been sitting in talks all day, every day for a week, right? So, what's going to make your presentation stand out? And sometimes it's not your results, because your results are pretty standard, or they're, exciting, but they're still just, the same types of plots people have been showing all week. So how do you really make an impact? I think some of it is making sure that the value of your results, or the purpose, or the the reason behind the experiments, that you lay that out clearly in the beginning of your talk. And you don't need to spend, half of your talk talking about why we should have better batteries, but you could give some examples, give some statistics about, how lithium is a limited resource. And so when, as we move to electric vehicles, we're going to need to find alternatives for other types of batteries. Enter this new material that I made that has the same energy storage properties as lithium, right? And so you sort of take them along the story of along the process that you followed in doing these experiments. And then by the time you get to the results, your listeners will be as excited about the results as you are, because they have sort of experienced this mini version of the process you did in running these experiments and making these decisions. And then they'll be totally with you when you make conclusions and sort of explain what this means for the field. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about today. I hope you guys have some cool presentations coming up. But yeah, just as a reminder, I mean, one of the important things when preparing for a presentation at a conference is getting some practice in, and also getting that right group of people to listen to your practice, to give you feedback. When building your slides and, thinking through how they look and the story they're telling, make sure you're not squishing too much into one slide. Remember that the folks in the audience are seeing this for the first time, so it needs to be digestible and it needs to be easy for them to understand. And finally, just, make sure that the story you're telling is a story, that you're giving them the beginning, the middle, the end. This is the why, this is the what, and this is the why it's important. And set yourself apart from all of the standard research presentations that we've all listened to, and make it entertaining, and have emotion behind it and passion, and people will appreciate that. All right. So that about wraps that up. Thank you guys so much for listening. Feel free to reach out if you want to be interviewed or if you have an idea for an episode topic. I am open to anything. You can follow us on Instagram at Impact Factor Pod, and or find me on LinkedIn, and we'll have a conversation. All right, well, that's it. Have a great week.